what we believe is one of the things wrong with education around the world, and depending on this system where higher education is really exclusive and expensive, and that there's a lot of strong knowledge like locked in institutions or companies, and we're all about opening up access to business knowledge and education.
Terah, why don't you go next?
Happy to go. My name is Terah Crews. I am the Vice President of Learning Solutions at Guild Education. Learning Solutions is the professional service arm of our learning marketplace. We work with institutions to help them better support working adult learners, which is really what Guild is all about. We work with large Fortune 500 companies to help provide debt-free pathways to working adults. Working adults, currently today are at about 35% of our higher education population. So we keep talking about these like 18 to 20-year-olds and how everything's changing for them in higher ed, but they're increasingly a smaller portion, and we expect that population to increase significantly over the next few years. So what Guild is doing is we're working with companies to really sort of create that connection between helping them upskill and better educate and train their workforce, while simultaneously working with our institutions and helping them better support this massive population of learners out there that need that support.
Great, and I guess I can go next. So hi again, my name is Mario, London-based at Emerge Education, investing in companies that are helping solve the skills gap. So a very specialist funds investing primarily in Europe, 80%, and then 20% in North America. Unlike a traditional funds, when we started perhaps 6 years ago, the amount of money invested in Europe in education was around 50 million. So it didn't really exist. And we went on a mission to realize that we're not going to change the ecosystem by just investing money in startups, but we also need to work with the key innovators and disruptors to help create better bridges to innovation. So over the years, we've partnered with over 50% of UK universities to speak to them and better understand their challenges in adopting education technology. And we're also proud to have a group of 15 individuals who are successful entrepreneurs with large exits as disruptors of traditional education. So in a way, we like to look at both the innovations for the existing establishment, but also the disruption that might come.
Fantastic. So I thought maybe we could start with the timely question that I think a lot of folks are asking themselves, which is, we've now been in shelter in place for, at least in the US, basically since March. And we've seen global ramifications of COVID across the world. How do you think, or what changes have you seen, or what changes do you expect as a result of COVID when it comes to the perception of higher education and what students expect from higher education, especially now as many students are learning via what they're calling Zoom University? Terah, maybe you can take this first and talk a little bit about some of the things that you've seen with the learners you work with.
Yeah, what's interesting about this time is I think it's allowed all of us, higher education, but also the organizations like ours that work with higher education, to really begin to question what I would say are the sacred cows of higher education. Like, how is it that we do what we do? And to really sort of put focus, which I think is where Guild started right at the beginning, on what is that learner experience? What is it like? How do we really reach learners where they are to make education more accessible and more flexible, and really sort of begin to sort of break down some of these barriers that aren't necessary. So as we think about sort of what's happening in this moment, I'm seeing it in everything from organizations that are doing short form, innovative education to sort of hit you what you need with the skills you need in the moment, but all the way to the institutions that are offering more traditional, longer form accredited program, really begin to question, okay, what is it that we do? How do we put the learner first? How do we make sure that their experience is great? And I think the challenging thing in this moment is, like, we're living in the disruption, we're living in some of this like tension, and we're going to see really amazing things come out of this, but we're also going to see a lot of failures in the process. But what's going to come out of the next 2 or 3 years, I think is actually fundamentally exciting, because we're getting the right conversation started.
That totally resonates. And Allie, maybe you can talk a little bit about some of the changes that you're seeing, especially given that you are working in a non-accredited institution. Like, have there been changes in perception or changes in kind of just cultural feelings in terms of the work that you're doing?
Yeah, first of all, definitely yes. I always say that these changes were already happening. The ground work was done there, and I think overall across the globe, people are moving more and more towards different forms of education, whether that is more about certificates and upskill training, you know what I mean, getting very specific training, because at the end of the day, it's all about a sacrifice of time and money. And especially in the business world, it depends what career we're talking about too. I don't want to generalize, because there are certain fields that will always have, or maybe not always, never say always or anything like that, but there's very structured learning paths for certain careers, like doctors, or very like hard skill, technical, vocational technical training programs, But when it comes to something like business, which is much more on the soft skills side of things and the ideas world and management and marketing, these shifts were already happening, right? And you see people getting certificates, and you see Google launching their colleges program and LinkedIn Learning and all of this. So this stuff was happening, but definitely with COVID, I think all of it is just accelerated because we're all just home. Even the traditional institutions are bringing all of their classes online. I think this big question of what is the best way to learn, and the answer of, is it really going to class in person and sitting in a room for a lot of hours with other people? Is this the most effective way to learn? Is this the best way to learn for everyone? Effective in time and money, of course. So I think people are more open to online learning. And then you see a lot of startups too starting to compete in this area of offering better, higher quality online education experiences too. I like that. COVID has been really dramatic and painful for a lot of reasons, but I think especially in online education, it's really accelerated what's happening here. And I think we still have a long way to go in terms of quality of online learning experiences. So yes, definitely there's been a huge impact. I think there's been a bigger capacity among people to try new things and check it out, yeah, I think definitely could talk about this all day long, but the answer is for sure there's been a big shift.
Yeah, no, that's super great to hear. And I think it's super thoughtful. And in the background, the loveliness of shelter in place. But Mario, maybe you could talk a little bit about based off of what Terah and Allie have said about the disruption and the changes that are happening in online education, how is that changing the way that you think about it from an investing perspective? Like, how do you think COVID is either changing or not how you're thinking about investing in the online education space?
Yeah, that's a great question. We've been quite fortunate with the performance of our portfolio over the last year, given that in most cases there have been many positive things to come out of for education technology. We've been saying the same thing for the last 6 years in Europe when we speak to universities, that they need to change, they need to adapt more technology. And funnily enough, in January, we started writing a report with the UK's university membership body to help them define a tech strategy for 2030. Very exciting piece of work. And in March, basically overnight, it felt like the 2030 strategy all of a sudden became the 2020 strategy. So there's definitely more urgency in terms of what we're investing in. It's still very much the same thesis we've had before, but with a lot more conviction now, as we're finally seeing a lot of university leaders having more authority and opportunities now to innovate like they've wanted to innovate. And we're also seeing, of course, a lot more power going to the students. Even pre-COVID, there have been influential reports from Kaplan suggesting many students will be open to consider non-accredited opportunities, assuming that they can provide good employment outcomes. So it's definitely expediting both how existing universities are thinking about the offer, making more digital, modular, flexible, personalized, but also making the alternative side of the market, like players like PowerMBA, on the other hand, that might be a more attractive, cheaper, and simpler offer. So those would be some of the themes.
Yeah. And I like the way that you mentioned the 2030 strategy basically became the 2020 strategy for a lot of people. I think for most institutions and universities at this point, which in some ways it's great. You're accelerating innovation, but in other ways, oftentimes you're unprepared that you have to create real fundamental and institutional changes. And so maybe Allie, you can take this first. You mentioned there are some gaps still in like the online learning experience. Like where do you think the online learning experience can be improved for students across the board, whether in something like the PowerMBA or in traditional kind of institutions?
Yeah. So I'll start anecdotally. In the beginning of the pandemic, and we've also been locked down since March here in Spain, still going. I was like checking out all these online free courses and everything. And it was like, Harvard is offering free courses from their regular professors. So I was like, wow, that's probably amazing. Let's see. And I checked out a couple courses and they were terrible. They were really, really boring. They were so dense. It was like monotonous and long, and the learning experience was really clumsy. Or I don't know, at work, we had to do a training about protocols and stuff. And the platform that I don't even know who the corporate partner was, but the training platform was so messy and so dense. And it was like the worst experience ever, and I bet all of us can relate to this. Have you ever gone through a terrible online corporate training, or just even, I don't know, at your university, maybe you had to do something like that. So I think number one, in terms of user experience and creating things that are interesting and engaging and relevant is number one for sure. And just because we put it in a video online, it doesn't translate, like the way you have an engaging discussion and interaction in a classroom is very, very different than when you're just with the screen learning. So that on the one hand, I think on the other hand, bringing human connection and networking online is a big challenge. It's definitely something that we're focused on because we have videos and we have a forum and we have a community and we try and facilitate interaction. But now that we have this quarantine situation and we can't have our in-person meetups like we used to have, it's definitely a big challenge of how do we, I don't think we're ever going to simulate in-person networking to a T. Like it's not the same about being in a bar or an event or a workshop, but how can we have curated online calls like this where you have small breakout rooms? Or I think it requires a lot more planning and knowing the participants that are going to come and, finding new tools, like maybe Zoom isn't the right tool, honestly. So I think those are two of the main topics. I mean, again, I could probably talk more and more, but I'll start there.
Yeah. And Terah, if I remember correctly, I think most, if not all, of the learning that happens via Guild tends to be online because it's usually most accessible option for the learners you're working with. And I could have that totally wrong, and please correct me if that's the case. Maybe you can talk a little bit about what you've seen work and where you still see there being gaps in the online learning world.
Yeah, currently most of our learning is online. And part of that is that what we know is that a lot of our learners, they're working adults. I mean, this is a mom at Walmart who is a cashier and has a lot going on in her life. That's a typical learner for us. So the online allows that sort of flexibility. I think, definitely doubling down on something that Allie said, there's a lot of work to be done here still in learning experience. And that's actually one of the places that Guild has been investing so heavily. Where I feel like we get stuck on the learner experience is that it's like we really need to begin to sort of break down what's going wrong there. So like I was actually a PhD student, thought I would be a history professor, dropped out in my second year, went and studied like behavioral economics at Harvard. And I can tell you, like, there's very little attention paid to this because that's not really what we're doing when we're preparing faculty. So if we want to start improving that learning experience, we want to start sort of like really making online great, we need to be able to break down the individual pieces. And as we've begun to sort of focus on this at Guild, the way I'd like to think about it is this: higher education for any learner is a roller coaster. When you pull an adult learner or a non-traditional learner onto this roller coaster, it becomes hardcore Six Flags. You want to puke at the end of it. We can very easily just get bogged with like too much to do here and trying to make that roller coaster flat and make it perfect, where I think organizations like Guild and others that are really innovative, what we can do is start with understanding where those dips are really low, where those dips sort of make that learner's stomach want to seep into their souls, and start propping up support systems around that. And I think for for us in what we're doing here, that's what we're beginning to do. And I also think anybody who's investing in ed tech right now, find the big dips. Or anybody that's trying to build an ed tech right now, find the big dips in the learning experience. If you can help solve some of that, we can help more students actually get the education and training they need, and get the outcomes they need to get the job.
That's such a great analogy. I'm going to start using that. I think that's a super helpful way of thinking about the learner experience. Mario, maybe talk a little bit about, in terms of staying on the same question around the online learner experience and where there's areas of improvement, and even to use Terah's analogy, where you think there might be the big dips and might be opportunity, at least on the investing side.
Yeah, definitely. First to say, to echo what Allie's saying in terms of making the education more industry informed, exciting, and bite-sized, for sure. What Terah's doing in terms of connecting the employees with education, definitely. And I'd add a third theme that we're very excited about is bringing the employer to the students. If we discussed education 40 years ago, it was kind of a given. You get your degree, you get a job, it's successful. Today, it's not a given that you're going to get a well-paying job and you're going to be on the right trajectory after potentially spending $200,000. And if you ask students why they get a degree today, 90% will say to get a job, right? So expectations have changed. However, universities have been slow to react and change that. And I'm not talking necessarily just, once you're graduating, provide you with a framework or platform to apply for jobs. I'm talking more, from day one, how can my experience be more relevant, more employer informed, so that when I'm graduating, I already have built a portfolio of internships, apprenticeships, project work experiences that make me much more employable from the start. So we're seeing a rise in this space. Pathstream in the US, we're investors in a company called Fourth Rev in the UK, doing something similar. Essentially, employers are not built to create learning businesses, and they essentially empower employers to take their qualifications, package them into courses that can be delivered at the university level. So you're getting the theoretical, the general education, the great academic support, but you're also getting the hard skills upon graduation to get you into a job. So I think that's a key component, and delivering that online opens up a much bigger market than the current 1 out of 25 students that end up getting a physical internship.
Absolutely. Can I jump on that for a second? This is something that I talk a lot, even outside of where I work right now. I have 2 business degrees, and I always speak about how it was so big and so many years dedicated. And did I really learn anything about business? Of course, I was a better presenter, and I made a nice network, you know what I mean? And I had life experience, and I grew up over those years. But did it really prepare me better for my career? Imagine if I alternatively had done an online program with bite-sized lessons or any type of hybrid learning, doesn't matter what program, but dedicated, say, a year to online learning, but then had 4 or 5 or 6 internships to complement this experience. Especially in business, I think it really is all about practical learning. And I would imagine in every field, really, right? What matters at the end of the day is your practical experience and getting training and complementing both of those together. So I think all sorts of education should be moving towards these practical models. So it's not about going 100% online and just replacing the online experience with what we traditionally did at 4-year institutions. But how can we make this balance between practical, hard skills and in-person learning? But I don't mean theory learning, like sitting and taking notes and listening, actually doing things in these skills.
So why don't we actually stay on this topic? Because I think this is a topic of conversation that a lot of folks are interested in, which is, let's talk a little bit about the gap between what employers want and what schools are teaching. And then how can you mitigate or remedy that gap, especially if you're teaching in a primarily online setting? What are the types of options or opportunities available? And maybe Allie, just to stick with you, maybe you could talk a little bit about how you think about that through the ThePowerMBA, and Mario and Terah would love to hear your thoughts as well.
Yeah, so it's actually not our strong point, the practical experience side. Although we promote it as a philosophy, it's not like we don't offer internships yet. Maybe in the future we'll build up to doing that. But our material is more targeted on people who either want to start building something for themselves and getting advice and tools to do that, and a network of people to support them in doing that, or people who are in more middle management jobs and want, it's more about like practical information, tools, advice, experience from other people complemented by theory. So I'm probably not the best person to talk about the internship side of things, although when students ask me this every day, I get questions about this in my career, because like Mario said before, at the end of the day, people are getting this education and going through these learning experiences to be better professionals, to advance their career, and to get jobs, right? So it's about how do you take the knowledge you have and apply it to a work experience, or leverage the network you have and help that work for you to get a job. So I do push them in the direction of doing internships, but we as a program don't actually have a piece on that.
You know, I would say that like one of the challenges here is we oftentimes treat learning in the classroom and internships as something that just has to, it's almost like we treat internships as the thing that makes up for what wasn't happening in the classroom. What sort of excites me about the guild model is we now have an opportunity to break down that disconnect between what's actually being built and delivered in the classroom and what the employers need. The challenge, I think, with higher ed, and look, I come from a traditional higher ed background, but also spent time on the business side of the house, is the challenge is like fundamentally we're speaking different languages. Higher ed is built for longevity. Higher ed, and that's not, and they're slow to act, and that's not a bug, that's actually a feature in it, because they have to survive forever. Business world needs to move much faster. Now we need to think about varying ways to sort of break down that divide. One great way to break down that divide is the really awesome work that ThePowerMBA is doing, and actually taking like practical courses and getting it to the student and getting it to that learner much quicker. Another sort of important way, and we're beginning to do more and more of that short form credentials at Guild as well. Another sort of important way is we need to figure out how to translate between the two. That's where Guild sits. We're sitting in between the employer, we're sitting in between the institutions. And what's really sort of works about our model is we have solutions teams. We actually have professional service teams that are deep into that company's employment and workforce needs, understanding what those things are, translating it through the Guild model back over to my team, where then I'm going deep into the institution and helping actually identify and build the programs. We're seeing this happen right now. As many of you probably saw, Walmart is launching healthcare centers around the country. This is amazing. I mean, this is the opportunity to put healthcare into, healthcare deserts, to get more people having access to better support. No better time to be doing this and sort of what's happening right now in the pandemic. But through our Live Better You program, we're actually able to identify certificates and that our needs, work with the higher education sector to build and identify those programs and make sure that that disconnect doesn't have to just be solved through the internship. It can actually it can be solved through better program design.
Yeah. Mario, do you want to take a step?
Yeah, definitely. So as I flagged earlier, it's a topic close to our hearts and something we've written about extensively. So I'd add the way we see the opportunity over and above what Terah is doing at Guild, but I think more focused on existing university students. One is making sure that the right content is on campus. So making sure that the courses, the skills are delivered. So, those are the fundamental blocks. That could be either bringing in a industry-inspired Udemy course that you can take. It can be the past stream, the fourth revs. You can learn Salesforce, whatever it is. I think the second key block is, finding ways to get that real experience. And that's the most difficult one. It's, how do I do my homework and at the same time do something that's useful for the world? Because the problem in education is you spend first 20 years of your life writing papers and essays, and then you get your first job and someone's like, okay, do something useful for me. And you're like, oh, I've never done anything, for a real world scenario. Companies that are doing things in this space we're excited about. Obviously, there's Ripen in Canada. People might have come across Parker Dewey, and it's as Terah was saying, it's really breaking down the task into the most modular pieces. So finding employers, usually SMEs, that really could use a smart person that can help with their digital marketing, perhaps with their Excel data set, and connecting that task with the homework that the professor is assigning. So the student is A, getting their homework done, and B, getting real experience and real references. And then, the last part of the equation is you can have all of this, but if you're not going to a tier 1 institution that doesn't have a good brand, it will still be very difficult for you to get the job. So it's building that ladder once you have all of these prerequisites to get into the job. So it's helping you figure out how to build a resume. We know career departments at universities are notoriously understaffed. It's finding opportunities for non-tier 1 university students to go to networking events with employers. It's essentially, getting in front of employers and having that opportunity to talk about what you're doing. And, Handshake is one player that's doing that in the US that we think is doing a very exciting job. But we think many other opportunities where the pathway is broken to actually get that first job.
I would love to jump in on that if I can. I think that one of the things that we sort of assume here and sort of still talking about is that you go to college to get the job. And I think, increasingly sort of going back to how many adult learners are coming in, and I think this is what we're seeing in Guild, like you can get the job to actually get the education. In part of the process. And when we have that, we can begin to sort of bake some of these experiences in such a way as that we can have this connection. And I think as we move forward, even what life looks like in a post-COVID world, this like episodic thing that I go to school, then I get a job, and then I quit my job, and then I go back to school. Like this is an opportunity for us to sort of rethink this and make it a lot more continuous, where we come in and out of work. And where, frankly, employers are playing an increasing role in helping guide the learners. What sort of like is the challenge for me, and like the shorter form education presents such opportunities, is that we still have this breakdown where even when the learners are learning basic skills, they don't know how to communicate those. And really being able to break down what's happening in the classroom, and sometimes just telling them explicitly, I'm a history major. I know how to do pattern analysis, and I know how to write, and I know how to sort of tell a story. Those are things that are good for business, but we just don't do a good job yet of like breaking it down and being explicit for our learners.
That is a fantastic point. I want to shift gears just a little bit, but staying around the general topic, which is, we know that tens of millions, the number is constantly debated, but we know that a large amount of the population will have to retrain, and more often than not over the next few decades. But we also know that process is hard and it's challenging and it's not easy to do, especially on your own. So could you all talk a little bit about what are the challenges that some learners face, and then also what are the types of support that you think they need in this journey? And maybe I'll ask Terah to go first on this, just because I know that Guild does an incredible job at doing a bunch of like wraparound coaching as part of their model. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think I'm going to again go back to my roller coaster analogy, that as we think about sort of where the learners are, the biggest sort of breakdown, particularly if you're talking about lower income population don't have social capital. I was actually a high school dropout and sort of worked my way through the system, eventually ending up at Harvard. Like there is it's very hard to understand what your pathways are. And even to understand what a degree, what a course, what an experience could mean for what your future career is. That's one reason why, to your point, like a big part of the Guild model is having that coach. When our learners go through Guild, and that we have over 3 million eligible learners in our ecosystem, they're actually matched up with a coach that is going to help them figure out their pathway, help them identify the right program. It's a simple thing. But for people who grew up with entering higher education, whose parents went to higher education, or whose family and whose network went to higher education, that type of communication and coaching is happening naturally. But when we're talking about more vulnerable populations, we have to supplement that. That's the thing that cannot be replaced by a purely technology experience. We need that human connection to help that learner navigate through what is, frankly, again, an emotional as well as intellectual experience.
Yeah. Allie, maybe you could talk a little bit on this topic as well.
Yeah, I think for this topic in particular, I need to zoom out a little bit. Like something we fundamentally believe at the PowerMBA that I think every day I believe more and more It's just that the entire system around education is really broken, especially in the US when it's so, so expensive. It's a little bit different in Europe, where depending on what country you live in, some things are paid for, the systems are different. But in general, I think we have this problem where we all believe that, like, we all bought into this idea, our families have, there's this pressure, and like we need to see it for the myth that it is, that like you need a degree, and the degree means that you're going to be better at the job or more qualified for the job. Like, it's just not true. And especially, as Mario was saying, if you're not at a tier 1 university. And I don't mean to say that you don't have meaningful experiences through traditional education, because you do. I benefited from them myself. You know, there's many ways in which I was formed into the person I am today, but I had way, way, way more formative experiences in the jobs that I've had. So it's really expensive to get higher education. It's also really expensive when you talk about opportunity costs and the investment of time that you need. And then on top of that, I also think the teachers that are in the way, where like, who is a teacher and why are they a teacher? And are they the best person for you to be learning from? You know, when you put all of these things together, and like when you're asking about alternative learners or people with from a more disadvantaged background, or people who are older and coming back to school and they don't have time, you know, like maybe they have the money, but they don't have the time because they're working full time. So, you know, it's hard to answer because I think it's just broken on so many levels. And I think we're all allowing this to keep going and to perpetuate like this. And especially people who are in hiring positions. As someone who does hire people, I always am looking really for things that have nothing to do with where they went to school, you know? So yeah, I think it's more about breaking down these other parts, about giving people support in options that are affordable and convenient for them to be able to learn quickly and integrate it into their daily routines, and not having to stop everything and leave their jobs. Maybe we wouldn't have so many other problems where those people get off track with their studies, or, you know, they're not able to continue, or they're making huge sacrifices just to get a particular degree. You know, like, I just think on all different fronts, I think we should be thinking about this much more outside the box. Like, does this really make sense the way this is all happening? And I think no, on every side, on every angle.
I totally agree, and I think that that's something we probably can all agree on, that there are still a lot of challenges that need to be addressed in the broader ecosystem. Mario, in terms of this question, like, have there been companies that you feel like are addressing some of these gaps that currently exist, or these challenges that currently exist in the process of retraining or reskilling? Or are there any companies that are doing it really well in terms of supporting their learners?
Yeah, it's a great question, and just to say, I couldn't agree more around the importance of humans in creating meaningful education outcomes. I think there are ways to bring down the costs of education. Perhaps a professor doesn't have to be saying the same thing every year. We can record those things, but supporting students in comprehending, grasping the knowledge, I think humans are very important. We've been very fortunate to invest in a company that is addressing this problem at a university level, called Mentor Collective over in Boston. And the thesis is, you know, many universities try and unsuccessfully have various mentoring programs because it's a logistical nightmare to connect students with alumni. And Mentor Collective essentially does that through technology at scale. So universities address students that they believe could use additional supports, either for generation students with a new experience at university, students that are struggling to figure out what they want to study, students that are struggling to figure out what they want to do as a career, and pair them based on, you know, joint preferences, previous backgrounds with other individuals that they can have meaningful conversations with. And in my opinion, it's one of the rare businesses that is able to show genuine impact from something that sounds very much like a woolly, soft engagement of, you know, if you can speak to someone, they can, you know, inspire you and support you, and things will change. But I'm a genuinely big believer in that. And you know, my personal stories, when I was 17, I was living in Bosnia and Herzegovina and started thinking about university, and, you know, dial-up internet. You know, I knew of university in the US, but nothing more than that. And through a set of luck and circumstances, was connected to a lady that became my mentor, that told me about the opportunities, told me about scholarships, told me about advice how to take the TOEFL and SAT, and for me personally, that had a transformative experience. So I think, involving humans in this role is super important. And perhaps on the corporate level, obviously there's a company called Coach Hub, which people might know, that is doing this from a upskilling and reskilling perspective with corporates, that has raised a lot of money and validating that thesis that even for existing employees, like Guild is doing, it is super important to have role models and people to speak with.
We're not talking about that much about K through 12 education here today, but this is really reminding me of a discussion I was having. Like, 3 of my aunts and uncles are teachers, and I'm originally from New Jersey, and so a lot of them are now doing like mixed classrooms because of quarantine, or some of them are working from home. Really depends where they live. But basically, anyway, it prompted this discussion about, we have thousands of 4th grade teachers across the US right now teaching very similar curriculum, replicating those lessons every single day. Every single one of them is really like breaking down how they teach, moving it online, and like, is this the best use of our collective resources? Should we all be putting this duplicated effort in around the country over and over and over again? And it makes you think about, even pre-quarantine, like, is that the best way to learn? And should we actually be using those human resources to have one-on-one mentoring and follow-up discussions and helping you where you need it, and more personalized education? Like, if every 4th grade teacher I knew had time to actually dedicate to their students on a more one-on-one personalized basis, because the actual academic theory-based things were being taught in a much more scalable, replicable way through video or some other, other ways. Like, it really makes you take a step back and think, like, I don't think we're doing this right. We're using so many resources, and are we getting an optimal outcome?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I think it's also one, even pre-COVID, that folks were debating. The personalized learning debate has been around for a while. And I see some folks talking about flipped learning, like that concept of a flipped learning classroom has been around for a while. And sadly, there are a lot of kind of systemic issues, especially in the US, where we're so disaggregated in terms of locus of control. It's challenging to kind of make broad sweeps of change. Which in some ways can be good and in some ways can be bad. It all depends on how you think about it. One question, just shifting gears a little bit, one question that I'm seeing a lot in the chat is related to soft skills. Like, how do you think about the role of teaching soft skills in higher education, whether it's traditional or non-traditional higher education, and how do you think that translates in an online setting? Mark, like, you want to go first?
Yeah, to start, I think people often neglect soft skills. I think soft skills are actually the hard ones to acquire. For hard skills, there's usually a pathway to get there, and if you have the right resources and supports, everyone has the a potential to acquire them. I think watching videos about how to negotiate or how to do sales is not in my opinion, answer to acquiring soft skills. So I think it all comes back to, you learn those soft skills at university, not by necessarily listening to your lecturer on negotiations, but by forming an extracurricular program with your peers, by being part of a German class, by negotiating student budgets for your organizations, and similar experiences. So I appreciate that might be a limitation of online, and the means we have and the limitations of technology still, with using Zoom, which I think many students and professors would agree is not made for education specifically, will create those challenges. But that being said, I think it can still create opportunities. If I'm attending a class on sales or negotiations, I can be put into groups and allocated to discuss things with peers online, rather than necessarily sitting in a physical classroom where it's one to many or group-based activities. So I think it's not easy. We still have a long way to go in cracking it online, but I think the opportunities are there.
I think the exciting thing about sort of where we are in this really hard moment in our world is that this is actually a time where begin to crack some of these things. So there were some of these sacred cows that like soft skills can't be acquired online. And I agree, like there's not really amazing ways to do this now. You know, we do need to create more intentional sort of interactions and touch points between students so that they're still having those sort of social communication moments. You know, the way that we think about teaching and allied health and nursing, we talk more intentionally about bedside manner, about some of those things. So there are things that we can be doing right now, just even bringing soft skills into the discussion. Because again, some of these things are happening, but the students aren't aware of it. When we're talking about working with learners, when we're talking about education, we're talking about a very uninformed consumer. And if we don't take that moment to really sort of bake this into our programs, say, what you're doing right here, this is teaching you this particular skill. This is like helping you learn how to do this. And this is how it's going to connect back to the workforce. That's like just that's like if step one is like, let's have modules and learning on entrepreneurship and sales skill. Step two is like, let's begin to sort of bake this into everything that we're doing in our teaching and learning models. But then there's the opportunity in this moment where we have no choice but to teach this way, to think about what comes next. I don't have a great sort of vision for that. I wish I did. But I think that what's exciting to me is that through all this pain and all this struggle, I think we're going to see some new innovations come out of this, particularly because 5 years ago when I was doing consulting, we would say the softer the skill, the harder the sell. To the student and to the company. Now the companies are beginning to sort of focusing on this, and certainly we're seeing it from our employers who are saying, hey, we'd like people to get better at these things. And that's sort of the opportunity we have as an industry right now.
Yeah. Allie, do you want to take a
I just wanted to add something very brief. I do agree with everything that's been said, but I also want to challenge the notion that like it's really difficult to teach soft skills online, because I think it depends which soft skills, right? Like which things are we really talking about? Because if we're talking about communication, there are definitely solutions for that. You know what I mean? If we're talking about responsibility, flexibility, deadlines, teamwork, we can do these things. It's hard and you have to be intentional about it. But yeah, I mean, I think because soft skills is always like a category, it's like very mushy. Like, what are we really talking about? So I think when you break the list down into which skills, we definitely can come up with good solutions for this, even online.
Yeah, that's great. So I know we're coming up towards time, and Grace will come up to make sure we answer some questions from the Q&A. But before we move to that, the last question that I have, and it's more of an aspirational question, is we're going through this time, as Terah was mentioning, of challenge and of struggle, and it's challenging for a lot of people across the board. As you think about us coming out the other end of this, hopefully, what do you hope is like the one change or the one lasting change that occurs during this time? Or what do you hope is the one lesson that we learn when it comes to online education during this time? I know that's hard, but one of maybe many.
I can kick it off. For me, I think there are a lot of lessons to be learned in how we're doing online education and how we do it well. And I really hope that groups that are doing, companies and institutions that are doing online education for the first time, really doing remote education, learn how to turn it into online education. But the thing that I am sort of most hopeful in this moment is that when we look back at the 2008 recession, a lot of people got left behind and never really caught back up. Those that could go and sort of go back to school and weather out a recession did. But a lot of people, there was so much focus on just getting them back to work, which is critical and really important, but not a lot of focus on how we can use that moment to help people get to a better place and to a place of more economic stability. Because this recession is affecting different groups of people so much, I really hope that what comes out of this moment in education is that we can have a conversation about who's being left behind. As we're thinking about technology, as we're thinking about new forms of education, are we doing it in such a way that's like meeting the people who need it the most, those frontline workers who have been most hit? So I like, what I'm hopeful for is like, because this disparity has been brought to the foreground by COVID, that we use this moment not to look past it, but to really sort of sit with that and figure out, okay, how do we reach these new audiences?
I totally agree with that, Terah. I think there's been a lot of conversation around the K-shaped recovery, at least in the US, in which the folks that are being left behind are even further being left behind. The folks that are doing well are fine moving up in terms of income, economic mobility. And so if there is one silver lining of this time, I hope it's this just reckoning of the divide that we've had historically, particularly in the US, and how much larger that gap is becoming, especially during this time. Mario, Allie, what would you add?
I mean, just to chip in on a macro level, one of my hopes is that aside from the employer-focused theme we've been discussing, I think there'll be a role for fully online education that will increasingly play a bigger role. I think there'll be a big role of blended education where there'll be some type of mixed results of physical and online. And I think, and I hope that leads to a lower cost of education that is often a barrier to entry for many individuals we're talking about that are locked out of the industry. I'm hopeful, even seeing this recession, when you look at people who have lost jobs and kept jobs, it is low skilled that are out of the economy, and if you have any strong hard or soft skills, your job is relatively resilient. What gives me confidence is that those jobs are out there. If you go on any employment platform, employers are still hiring, they still need talent, and my hope is that the opportunities to through cheaper, more flexible education can be steered towards the right people to fill in those jobs and benefit the whole economy.
I have one very practical one that I'll start with, is that I think if we haven't seen the value in governments and entire communities investing in internet access, like it's plain as day, right? We need this. Like, we already needed it before, but when you are forcing all learning to happen online and all workplace activity to happen online, well, as much as possible, like it's really an essential resource that we all need access to. So access to internet, number one. On a less practical level, I would say I would just go back to this resource allocation of who are the people who are teaching things? How are they teaching them? Why are those? Do you have the best number one teacher in a topic? And like everyone wants to learn from that person about that topic. I saw someone post in the chat about a negotiations professor. If every student who took negotiations could learn from the top 5 people who know about negotiations and see experiences and case studies of that, and then have some practical experience, I don't know, just resource allocation of having the best teachers and having that information that those people have. Why is it locked in these institutions and locked in these specific companies? The entire world is made up of way more small and medium-sized businesses than massive conglomerates, right? So we want all of these employees and human beings to be skilled and have access to that information. Thinking creatively about resource allocation and who we're learning from and how we're having access to that knowledge.
Yeah, I think that was a very aspirational, perspective of how we think the world or how we hope the world is going to change. And thank you so much for that. With that, I will turn it to Grace, who I think is going to ask some questions from the audience.
Yeah, so I think it piggybacks pretty nicely off what you were just starting to chat about, which is there's a lot of questions about teachers and the perspective of teachers. Obviously, many of them have had to pivot really quickly and aren't being properly trained on the technology or different ways of engaging students. Can you guys talk a little bit about that, like to the point, Allie, of like giving the best top teachers, what are we going to then do with the rest of the teachers who have been trained to teach people and have skills of engaging people in person? How do we make sure we're not leaving them behind? And
yes. This is like the number one follow-up question. But I have an answer. So it's a bit what I mentioned before. Those people can be using their skills in a much more individualized basis. They can be training, doing workshops, mentoring sessions, dedicating their time, instead of just replicating that lesson, replicating other things, like finding other resources or formative experiences. So I mean, it's not to say that those people should be fired and shouldn't be teachers. I think it's just about reimagining what it means to be a teacher and the different levels of learning, because you have to learn about the concepts, but then you need examples and practical experience and follow-up and reinforcement and all of these things.
Yeah, I think it's talking about sort of like that sort of question of like what happens to the other teachers. I agree that there's opportunities for teachers to have more of those one-on-one experience. How much time is spent on prepping materials and sort of prepping pedagogy? I would also say too that like our teachers do more than just sort of like teach an individual course and curriculum. They're also producing knowledge in part of the process. So as we think through, if in a world where we are leveraging more sort of source content and expertise, I would hope that would actually be adding to their actual delivery of teaching and allowing them, in addition to one-on-one, think about freeing up time for them to think about creative pedagogy tools, for them to think about what can they add on top of that course and negotiation there that's really helpful. They do it better than anything I ever could do. But there's this like this other piece that's sort of connected to negotiation. Now I have the time and free up to actually add to that knowledge. I think there's I don't know what this looks like yet, but I think there's this moment here where we have an opportunity to leverage the collective and actually free people up to add more to the collective knowledge. And so it's moving to a world where we leverage more sort of produced content doesn't mean only a few people teach everything that there is, or there's only one right way. It actually means all of us have more energy and creative time to produce and create, but managing that experience and ensuring that we don't get into a world where all knowledge is sort of like centered on a few people, then who decides what those few best people are? That's the thing that I think we have to be very mindful of and careful of, because I certainly love the diversity of our education system and how many voices come into that conversation.
I also, just to add to this, I also have to admit that I think most online learning solutions right now, which I'm imagining most educators are using either Zoom or Google Hangouts, are not made for education. If you think about what are the best practices when it comes to teaching, and that's my academic background, my graduate degree is in education. When you think of the best practices when it comes to teaching and educating, it's so much about like this with itness that you lean into small like conversations that are happening between two students. You like notice when a student is like getting a bit tired or unfocused. Like there's so much that happens in person that you pick up as a great educator. There's so much small like group learning that you can facilitate as an educator that, to be quite frank, just doesn't really work well in a Zoom setting. And to be fair, Zoom was not made for that. And so I do think that there is an opportunity to actually create an online learning platform, an online learning solution that helps to facilitate best practices that we know work for teaching, and then also actually it augments like your teaching practices. I think we're very, very early. It's very nascent in terms of the market right now.
Awesome. I think we have time for one more, but first, Mario, the 2030 strategy paper, a few people have been asking for it. If you have an accessible link that you want to share in the chat, I'm sure people would love to see that. I think finally, the ongoing discussion is going to be about the difference between someone having a very traditional degree from an accredited university and the fact that many companies and organizations have put that at the top of their list of importance, and so much of what we've been talking about is more skill-based, entrepreneurial, really specific, honed in on one topic or one industry. And so do you see it shifting one way or another? Do you think there's options for all to still exist, and it's some is better for other people? Just kind of those directions that there's clearly a shift, but just kind of what you're seeing.
I can jump in here to start. I think we need all of the above. And I think we need all of the above because we need to acknowledge that it's still the coin of the realm today. And there's a lot of social capital. And particularly if we start talking about those lower income and disadvantaged population, like this is a 4-year degree still is enormously beneficial to them because it's a ticket to that next job and into that sort of next step up. Now we can argue all day whether that's accurate or not, and I think that's a really good argument to make. But I would say as we're trying to invent the future, and as we are inventing the future right now, we need to pull from Clark Gillard's book on like dual transformation that we need to invest in our core and where it still has a lot of value, which is in still big populations of our market, while simultaneously investing heavily in the future of education. And, you know, my sort of hopefulness is that we get to a world where all of the above do exist, but we get better at about helping learners find the right thing. It doesn't always have to be a 4-year degree. It doesn't always have to be a short form credential. Get the thing that you need that's going to get you where we are, and we can get to a place of guiding people to that, the right option for their goals.
Yeah, great point. I know we're running out of time, so I'll just agree.
Yeah, I totally agree. I always mention, a friend of mine says, like, it's easier to find the best burger in town than figure out like what you should do for your career. And I think that's exactly like Terah's point. Each individual person is going to have different goals and will have different needs, and therefore, like, you need a diversity of options. What we need to focus on is how do you actually build an ecosystem of support so that people can actually figure out what that is for them.
Wonderful. Well, I think that's a great place to end, and you all were full of great insights. I really appreciate all your time, and the chat was going crazy the whole time, so everyone was loving your conversation, adding different points. I hope everyone got a lot out of this, and you met someone new, you learned something interesting. So thank you to our 4 panelists. You all were wonderful, and we hope to see you all soon. Be well.
Bye, thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you all.